Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Jesse Hartman, veteran tutor, co owner of Hartman Tutoring, also a poet and award winning lyricist. Welcome to the show, Jesse.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show. Welcome to India in this online form, Jesse. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk about. We'll talk about how to redefine education that you are doing through mentorship and critical thinking. We'll talk about all this. But before that, let's understand a bit about your background, your journey, so that people know who they are listening to.
Sure. So my journey began in New York City. I was born in the early 1980s in downtown Manhattan. I was raised by two public school teachers, and the world of education was something that I came to value as I got older. As a kid, I didn't love school. I liked playing basketball with my friends, talking to girls, running around New York City. School was kind of this annoying thing. But I did appreciate the creative pursuits that were afforded to me from the classroom and outside the classroom as well. I was really interested in writing, poetry, songwriting, even writing short stories and essays was something I really did enjoy. But the notion of education as an industry, as a practice, or as a student, I was not so into it. But I went to school and as a university student, and I graduated with a degree in philosophy and television production, also known as nothing. And I was looking around for something to pursue in terms of a career. And I ended up tutoring alongside my mother. My mother had established herself as a tutor in the neighborhood in the 1990s. And she had a few students who were working on some material that was a bit too complex for her. So she asked me if I could help. I helped one student. That student told a friend. The friend told a neighbor. Their neighbor told a cousin. Suddenly I had a job. My mother and I grew the business over the next few years. By the time I was 25, I was the co-owner of our company, which was called Hartman Tutoring. And now 20 years later, we're still going strong. So I have a lot of hours of tutoring experience under my belt. We've worked with over 2,000 kids as a company, and we have a pretty robust staff right now, usually between 15 and 20 tutors working with us throughout the country on Zoom, often in person, in New York City and beyond. So I really do feel quite fortunate to have had the journey that I've had. It was a remarkable joy to be working alongside my mother, and also really a gratifying treat to be able to work with students in a one-on-one capacity over the last 20 plus years.
Absolutely, absolutely, Jesse. So, what has changed when you first started, with the work that you started in terms of tutoring and now? Has it changed drastically? Is it the same? Are the challenges new? Just want to understand it from your point of view because you are dealing with the present generation.
That's right. It's a great question. Suddenly, I found myself old enough to be able to look back and notice how things have changed. That was surprising to me that I'd reached the age where I was like, oh, my past is the past. Interesting. So a lot has changed. Yeah. Education in New York City, education in the States, education globally, especially because of COVID, has pivoted quite a bit the last 4 or 5 years. Technology and culture have changed. That's impacted education. I myself have changed. When I was in my early and mid 20s, I was definitely living a different life, and I viewed education from a different perspective than I did when I moved into my mid 30s and 40s. So my view has changed, the world has changed, and the local districts, neighborhoods, and school systems that I'm accustomed to working with have changed as well, and consequently, so have the children. There is a number of ways that this has happened. One of the most profound things that I noticed moving from around 2005, 6, 7 into 2008, 9, 10, 11 was a shift in the way that a lot of students viewed themselves as learners. What I was accustomed to as a student, and what most of the students I worked with in my early tutoring days, was a view of themselves in a nuanced form. Sometimes things were a little bit easy, sometimes things were a little bit hard. Some subjects were a little bit more challenging and perhaps a bit harder to grasp. Other subjects were on the more naturally digestible side for a lot of kids. And there was this nuanced gray experience a lot of students would have in school where some things were better than others, but for the most part, everything kind of stayed in the middle. And around 2007, 8, 9, 10, what I started noticing from the way that students describe their own experiences, from the language that a lot of young people were using in general, was a much more extreme and binary view of themselves as learners and often the world in general. Things were no longer nuanced and gray in the middle. They were either all or nothing, very black or white. And so the language I heard a lot of students ascribe to themselves was, I'm either horrible at this or it's easy. It's either impossible or it's no problem at all. And the notion of nuance started to get lost. And when it comes to learning, nuance is reality. We are not going to just go from I don't know this subject at all to I'm an expert. There's going to be this middle ground, which is really what the journey and experience of education is. And when a student doesn't believe that that middle ground is for them or that it's even a part of their experience, then they're often going to just assume that whatever's difficult for them in the moment is permanently going to be out of their grasp and unattainable. So this was an uphill climb that was not just in the world of educating, but really in terms of me approaching how young people view themselves and the world around them, and helping them to recognize that there is nuance out there. Just because something feels uncomfortable or difficult in the moment doesn't mean that that's a permanent condition for them. And the idea of progress being the goal, not perfection, really became the focal point for a lot of my work. So that's one very specific, but also rather broad way that I noticed that education and students have changed over the years.
Absolutely, absolutely. The loss of nuance in today's time. If I understand, your goal is to reach learners not as a teacher, but as a mentor and academic guide. But how do you teach about this nuance? Is it some sort of a injectable that you can inject into students and bring that nuance? It's almost like a loss of our human instinct, or something like empathy, that we nuance is also missing. How do you then aim to? How are you doing it, teaching learners not as a teacher but as a mentor and academic guide? Help us understand this part.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're right. It's very challenging. Teaching empathy is something that a lot of adults and teachers might believe isn't even possible. They would assume that it's something that has to come from experience. And a lot of times, notions of understanding nuance or appreciating truth in a more complex way does usually result from experience and learned understanding. However, when a child is 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, and they've decided that what they feel in the moment, which is either for a kid, usually discomfort or pleasure, is what is, without the possibility of shifting, of changing, of a granular adjustment, then it's going to be difficult for them to go through their life experiences expecting or appreciating the possibility of nuance being a part of their lives. So I aim to reach every kid individually. And in terms of being an academic mentor or a guide, the first thing I need to be able to do is read the student, figure out what makes them tick, what lights them up, what makes them really excited and feeling passionate about something, what do they care about? And I want to talk to them in their language and make sure that what they see and what they experience, what they feel is being validated and is being recognized and is allowed in the room. If they love language, they are really into reading and writing, they love maybe going to a play or watching a movie, I'm not just going to sit there and pound science and math into their head. I'm going to try to find the avenue into their interest levels that most lights them up. And when it comes to finding nuance, even if I have to take the perspective of talking about sports or comedy or dance, they're going to have to come with me on this ride to start to appreciate that the world is not all or nothing. It's not a zero-sum game. There aren't only extremes. In the moment, we can feel these extremes, but the context does often matter. A lot of times this plays out with standardized test taking. I do a lot of test prep coaching, and a lot of students enter these experiences expecting it to be a direct reflection of school. Very often in school, a student wants to get 100% on a test or 90%. If they get 70% on a test, that's objectively bad. But in the world of standardized test taking, that changes. Suddenly 70% is pretty good because the balance, the way that the scores are working shifts. And that requires a nuanced appreciation for context. So I'll have to explain it to a student. And what I'll say, maybe I'll use American sports as an example. I would say if you're a basketball player and you shoot 40% when you're playing basketball, 40% is decent. That's pretty good. It's not great. It's not awful. You're kind of moderate. If you're a baseball player and you get a hit 40% of the time, you're the best hitter ever to play the sport. You're in the Hall of Fame. You're a legend. So 40% isn't always just 40%. The context does matter. And we have to appreciate the nuances of not only what we're learning, but how we're learning it and how we're viewing ourselves as learners along the way. So that's just one brief example. The goal is to really reach the student, find out what they really do value and what language they speak, try to really get into their heads and reach them where they are, and then find the avenue towards these more expansive and more complex ideas.
Absolutely. So, when you talk to students, uh, do you think they want to be a Charles Dickens, a Shakespeare? Do they want to be, work in manufacturing, much more of marketing in AI, or want to become a YouTuber? I want to understand where do they want to go exactly, and that's the way you can, train them, mentor them. What is it that they want to do, especially in the US?
Right. That's a great question. There's a broad spectrum right now. The examples you named are definitely on the list. A lot of students, a lot of young people grow up seeing YouTubers, seeing influencers as role models. And they do view that as a professional path that they could potentially pursue, either because they have an interest in communication, they have an interest in sharing their lives, or it's just the world that they grow up seeing and they want to be a part of it because most young people emulate those who they find appealing around them. Other young people that I work with are still viewing the world through their parents' eyes. And they hear professions such as lawyer, doctor, business person as being appealing, as being a powerful and secure field to enter, and as being an industry that is prestigious and worth pursuing. It's the students who are beginning to really be 100% honest who say, I have no idea. Those are the voices that I hear most prominently. The ones who say, you know what, I don't love most of the classes I take in school. I don't like the idea of being online for a living and going, hey guys, look at this box. I'm going to open it. Maybe there's shoes inside. Nor do they view what their parents have done as being a realistic part of the 2030s and 2040s that they know that they're going to be members of working society during. So a lot of students are fairly and justifiably a bit perplexed. They know that AI is coming. They know that a lot of professions that have historically been open to young people in the workforce might not be available. And the question is, what is the working world going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years? And the answer is pretty undefined. And a lot of young people know this. So what I really encourage most young people to do is go step by step, continue to follow their passions, be honest with themselves and recognize what it is that they really do feel naturally inclined to pursue, and stay open to where that field is going to go. The world is changing really quickly, and for students to remain nimble is really the goal. When I was a young person, I viewed the world as being kind of a closed box compared to where it is right now. And most young people do feel a little bit without direction because of how open everything is. But also, once they start to recognize that they don't have to have these professional questions answered at age 14, 15, 16, that calms them down a little bit, and they recognize, okay, so they can get their feet planted on the ground a bit when they're in college, when they're new graduates, and start to see what the world has to offer them. And hopefully their skill sets and their interests can find a fit for what the world provides. But currently, students are aware of one thing, and that's the world is changing quickly, and it's hard to predict what'll be around in 5, 10 years.
Absolutely. Let's come to critical thinking part. You emphasize on the importance of critical thinking, loss of nuance, and also perhaps the loss of critical thinking. What is left here then? How would you like to put critical thinking for them, even for a lot of people who might be thinking about it but losing about it? What is critical thinking? Help us understand how do you bring critical thinking back in today's time with attention span of say 8 seconds, 5 seconds, 3 seconds, and and so many other things which are just not letting you have that critical sort of letting you be in silence or in peace and do some thinking. Help us understand as an educator about this, Jesse. Even I will
It's a
learn.
great Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that we all could learn a little bit more about. When I have prospective tutors or my staff and we're doing a training session and we're talking about critical thinking, these are people who have gone through college. They often have their master's degrees. They're professional educators. I'll ask them to define critical thinking. Usually what most people have in mind when they're aware of the term, they know it's important. They'll say, well, thinking is, but critical thinking is like, and what is that? How do you define that? How do you teach that? We need to be able to really put our finger on what this phrase means and how we can allow students to enhance their abilities in this realm. So critical thinking is the pursuit of having a valid reason to understand why something may or may not be true. It's about recognizing a valid conclusion from an invalid one and having a toolbox to be able to access and apply to gain this understanding. Epistemology is a really complex idea, having a basis for knowing why you know something, especially as we just discussed, how the world is changing very quickly. The way that people 20 years ago might have come to a collective understanding of what is true is quite different than it is nowadays, and probably is quite different than how it was 20 years prior. The idea for young people now is to think, who do they trust? What resources can they really access that they can rely on as being verifiably true? And then how can they trust their own sense of self, their own first principles experiences to know when something is or is not valid? So we work on having an understanding of logical fallacies, of recognizing just because A is true, that doesn't mean that the inverse or converse of A is not true. Having an understanding of what makes for a reliable source, knowing about biases, understanding that there aren't always facts connected to statistics. There's a lot of ways to be either manipulative or deceptive or just wrong when it comes to statistics. People can use the truth to say or imply things that are not true. Inferences are different than assumptions. So a lot of this has to do with nuance because we have to understand the different ways that various items can act depending on context and depending on the different features that are attached to them. So a lot of this comes with understanding language and also gaining a sense of media literacy. In 2025, so much of what students ingest comes from different forms of media. And it's interesting that a thing like Facebook was first referred to as a social network because it's a place where people used to socialize and network. Then it became social media. And when I was a kid, the media were journalists. They were professionals who had gone through some sort of schooling and training, who were going to uphold some sort of professional criteria. Suddenly, it's an 11-year-old with a Facebook account. That's the media. Or in 2025, it's TikTok. And the idea of who is a bot and who is a real person, who is an outside agent who's actually trying to cause trouble, who's really just an innocent person who's sharing their opinion, who's trolling, who's being sincere, what is actually a photograph, what has been doctored, what's a real video, what's a deep fake. There's a lot for kids to be confused about. And then there's the idea of losing faith in institutions. The notion of the media was a respected concept years ago. Since the 1970s, 80s, 90s, going into the 2000s, that trust in media has declined, often for justifiable reasons. And institutions that are in the world of education, that are in the world of science, trust in these institutions has also declined. So it's harder now, I think, for younger people than it has been in a long time to know what or why something is true. And that's the very reason why learning and gaining and practicing critical thinking skills is so important right now.
So can you learn these skills, or it is part of our inherent nature to understand things, in the way and question things accordingly? Is critical thinking something of a learning skill, Jesse? Can it be learned? Uh, Help us understand this. And if it is, how do you do that? That is where, because a lot of people need to, in this, especially in the times of artificial intelligence, fake news, it's a global system, and people are propagating their views, ideas. There are still people who think that the earth is flat, and that there are still people who think so many other things. I don't know what is 100% true, 100%, but at least I know at least to understand things from different perspective. There are scientific theories that are established theories, that are so many things. I want to understand, can these things be learned, or is it, let me ask it in a very different manner. Do you think the present generation has it in them to take this whole mantle of humanity and take it forward without that much of a critical thinking that humanity had, say, 10 years or 20 years back?
I certainly hope so. The notion of a generation, especially if we're speaking globally, is quite broad. General and generation, we have a lot of different people that we're talking about here. So I think it's easy for us to view certain voices and maybe even certain pockets and certain groups as being a monolith. But in reality, young people are quite varied in New York, in America, across the world. And I do believe that there isn't that much uniqueness, if we're speaking generationally, between what we're seeing with young people right now versus what we might consider the young generation 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 60 years ago. What their experiences is different, but a lot of what's happening is young people are figuring it out. And young people are always figuring it out. Most young people never know stuff. The idea of being sophomoric, the word sophomore, soph means wise, and then more comes from being a moron. A sophomore is just a wise moron. They're wise because they aren't brand new, but they still have a lot to learn. And this is what most young adults are experiencing. They're not quite little children, but they're still on the path towards gaining understanding. And this isn't really a novel notion for young people in this current generation. Young people are often pretty confused. But I agree with you that it does feel like they're fighting an uphill battle more so now than perhaps generations in the past. But the good news is I do feel confident that what they're going to gain is the ability to utilize these technologies that adults might feel like are hindering their understanding or appreciation for truth or for wisdom. But the hope is that as this young generation gets older and gets more experienced, they're going to be able to harness these faculties and these technologies in a way that's very meaningful and productive. And I have great faith, not only in Gen Z, but in Gen Alpha's ability to look at what's gone on in the early 2000s, which was really, honestly, the early stages of social media, of the internet as a global function, and start to learn what mistakes have been made, either individually or collectively, and learn from them to enhance how we use these tools moving into the next generation. A lot of technologies that come around, I think of Gutenberg and the printing press. I think of a lot of different ways that cars changed society. It's easy to look at people who are using these technologies in its earliest inception and say, well, this isn't good because look at all the problems. But really all that it is very often is we're figuring out the kinks and we're learning how to use it properly. And so I do believe that a lot of what's gone on the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it's a learning curve. And I do believe that Generation Z and Gen Alpha is going to look at what came before them, find the gaps, find the missteps, find the overreaches, hopefully not respond in an overreactive way, gain an appreciation for balance and for moderation and for nuance and truth. To answer the question of can critical thinking skills be taught, I do it all the time. Either when it comes to an academic school setting or just for living life. I like to start small. I'm not going to try to reach a child and have them have a global understanding of geopolitical accuracies. I want to start just in their own daily lives of how do they know something is real or not just when they experience it, and then build out from there. But the goal is for children to start to appreciate and value truth. I feel like in our culture, at least in America, there isn't all that much of an appreciation for truth. And that is step one, is gaining an understanding of why it even matters. Why is it important that when you're communicating with somebody that you're saying what you actually do feel and believe to be right, and that you can expect the same from the person who's speaking to you? Why is that important for your own life, for your own experience, and also for us to collectively exist as a society? Why is it really valuable to put a premium on truth? I start there, and then we start to learn how to sniff out instances where something might be approaching true but not quite true, et cetera, et cetera. Just the same way that any young person can learn any form of comprehension. Critical thinking is a form of comprehension. We're understanding the world around us and how to interpret it. So if we can do this while reading a novel, while watching a movie, while having a conversation with a friend, then we can do it when reading a news article or watching an event unfold live in front of us. It does take work, and we have to apply certain tools and skills while perceiving reality around us in order to use critical thinking skills. It doesn't just happen naturally. But young people, just like anything else, have the ability to learn and practice these skills. But step one is having an appreciation for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well explained that, Jesse. I want to understand the role of the education system everywhere also, but specifically to the US. Do you think it has failed the new generation? It is failing the new generation, or is it finding it hard to match up to the requirements of the new generation? What is your understanding for this?
That's a great question. The last 5 years have been difficult because of COVID. Entering 2020, there was more of a uniform understanding of what, for instance, a reading level for a 10-year-old should be like, or a math level for a 14-year-old should be like. Since 2020, that understanding of where a certain age group should be educationally has become much more broad and much more varied. So I do think that the school systems are having a harder time reaching a wider variety of learners post 2020. My hope is that that'll start to even out as COVID gets farther behind us. But really, 2020 and 2021, whatever trajectory a lot of students were on, it spun a lot of them off, and it spun them off in different directions. So what used to be a group of 20 kids that you could really just speak to 20 kids all at once, now it's much more broad. So I think that that's a challenge for the educational system. Prior to 2020, there are certain factors in America that have been lacking. That's for sure. Reading, writing, and arithmetic, these skills have been dwindling. And the notion of it being the educational system that's failing the students, it's hard to really put a finger on if it's happening in the classroom, if it's happening at home, if it's happening personally for each one of these kids. Because learning isn't just about what goes on between a teacher and a student, or even a school system or a department of education and a student. Very often, other factors are involved: a student's diet, a student's sleep habits, a child's belief in themselves, a child's overextended belief in themselves, what goes on in the home life, how much stability they have, how much emotional support they're receiving from their parents, how much time with their parents they're actually experiencing shared with them. All these factors come into play. So I had the experience of beginning my education career after 9/11. So I've seen a lot of America change, a lot of New York change, and consequently a lot of education and parenting change as a response to this shift that's happened culturally in the States. So it's hard to really just put your finger on the educational system and say, okay, because the educational system is there and students are there, we can draw a line of causality. There are so many other factors to potentially consider. But what I would love to see is for young people to feel seen in their classrooms by their teachers. And I think that that is one factor that's occurring, at least in the States, that perhaps 30, 40, 50 years ago, adults were viewed as authority figures worthy of being listened to. Adults knew the answers that kids did not. And often because of technology, that role has flipped. Now we have parents turning to their 12-year-olds and saying, can you get the setting on my phone to work so that I can see something? Or can you make this app work? And it's the 12-year-olds who are like, ugh, mom, yeah, fine. Just give me, I'll show you. And these aren't just frivolous items. These are ways that adults are expected to do their jobs, to interact with grandparents, to make sure that their family's budgets and finances are running the right way. And it's the kid who has to help the parent get onto the banking app because the parent can't figure it out. This is an inherent shift that a lot of children and consequently students are experiencing. So when they look at their teachers or authority figures, principals, anybody setting up a curriculum, kids aren't just automatically thinking, well, they have gray hair, so they must know. In fact, it's often the opposite. So I would really value the idea of teachers and authority figures meeting kids where they are and giving them good reason to trust them, giving them good reason to view them as reliable authority figures, people who they can really come to with honest questions and get honest answers, and have the answer not be, go look on ChatGPT, that'll tell you. The first experience should really come from humanity. And as long as children are recognizing that these tools that are really, called smartphones or artificial intelligence, it's a smart phone. It's artificial intelligence. We still have smart people and actual intelligence. I'd love for these resources to really be used first. and then recognize that these other tools, they're there, they're helpful, they're convenient, and they're pretty cool, but they shouldn't be first, second, and third. Really, I'm hoping that young people can feel like they have a rapport and a connection to adults, so that educating can still happen on a person-to-person basis.
Absolutely, absolutely, Jesse. And that is where, the thing that is required today is to be an effective educator. People like you who are bringing that whole thing together, trying to tell the kids actually about what it is like to learn the right things, also through critical thinking, and also to by learning nuances and everything else. So, in your sense, for educators, how do they become an effective educator in today's time, and also for the learners, for the students, young kids, to understand that just knowing smartphone does not make them smart. Even a lesser smart person with a smartphone will not become smart, and that is life and wisdom beyond technology. How do they become a successful learner? So effective educator, as well as how to be a successful learner. That's my last question to you.
It's a great question. So I like to try to distinguish the difference between information, knowledge, and then you just use the word wisdom. And I think that a lot of what goes on nowadays is that these three concepts have become intertwined and they're being misapplied. So information can be factual, and you can find information in a lot of different places, very often online, perhaps in a book, perhaps you can gain information from somebody telling you a fact. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you understand it and that you have ownership of this content. So that's where knowledge comes in. It's really to understand information and have ownership over it when you feel like you know it. And then to be able to use that knowledge properly and responsibly and equitably out in the world, well, that's when it becomes wisdom. And in my mind, a proper educator would have those three goals distinguished and have all three goals in mind. Wouldn't it be nice if when we thought about the purpose of school, we all believed that it was so that children would emerge from school being wise? I feel like that isn't even a word that we use anymore, or that we even believe could be real. It sounds like it comes from some sort of wizard in a cave in a science fiction book. It's real though. And the goal would be not to just know how to use an app so you can get information, period, at the end. Get the information, have ownership over it so you have knowledge, and then learn how to apply it so you have wisdom. A lot of teachers really think about content because that's what shows up on a test, and test scores are often how we gauge whether or not a teacher or a school is functioning properly or successfully. But content without skills isn't really all that useful. And what students really hope to gain from the educational experience, either consciously or subconsciously, is more than just, did I gain the content so I can spit it out on a test and get a good grade? It's, can I emerge from school with some sort of ability to function in this world, either in college or university, in the working world, or just as a person walking around, bopping around as a person on the planet, trying to live my life as an adult. The goal would be not to just know stuff, but to feel ownership over it and then how to use it. So skills, and skills don't only mean, by the way, the skill to solve a math problem or the skill to write a paper. Effort is a skill. Autonomy is a skill. Accountability is a skill. These are all features of learning that come from really executive functioning. And I would, when I think about what would make an ideal or effective educator, it would be valuing these executive functioning skills just as strongly as you might something more kind of nuts and bolts concrete, like how to do long division or how to write an intro paragraph. Just because a kid can write an intro paragraph doesn't mean that they're going to do their best work. And that sense of motivation, that internalized incentive, is often viewed as an executive functioning skill. So a teacher might think to themselves, ooh, I know, you can't just show somebody like, here's a fish. You got to teach them how to fish. Not only are you supposed to teach somebody how to fish, you have to teach them why fishing is important and have them believe from their own selves that it's valuable to go out there and fish and to do your best every time. Because if we're not out there trying to catch those fish, we're not eating. So knowing how to fish is one thing, but actually doing it and trying your best is another. The goal would be to have all of these intertwined. So distinguishing how knowledge, information, and wisdom are different, but then also having them as priorities is valuable for both teachers and learners.
Wonderful. There's much to learn from you, Jesse, about all these things. And I'm sure a lot of educators, a lot of learners would want to learn more about you, more from you and more about Hartman Tutoring and everything else. So, what's the best way for them to connect with you, Jesse?
So Hartman Tutoring is the name of my company, Hartman. So you can go to hartmantutoring.com. You can check out all the services we offer there, read about how we do things. And there's a contact tab there. So you can contact me through the website, or you can email me at jesse@hartmantutoring.com.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thanks.